Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Becky Kovach. We are discussing The Dark Tower, The Drawing of the Three, which is the second book in the Dark Tower series, and it's a little bit longer than The Gunslinger, which we previously discussed, but Becky, I know you've read more of these books than I have, so is this where things start to pick up for you, or is this sort of just another one of those books where it's like, okay, we're almost getting to the good stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it does pick up a little bit from The Gunslinger. I felt like The Gunslinger was a very slow-moving book, and considering it was so short, like, I still can't believe it felt that way.
Yeah.
So with Drawing of the Three, it's still very much setting things up for what's to come later on, and just kind of like leading us to where we're eventually going. But it does pick up a little bit more. There's a lot more action, I would say, than in The Gunslinger, which is great. And it's cool because you do start to learn even more about Roland, who is, as you know, our main character and our hero in this series. Or I don't know if I would call him a hero. I guess maybe an anti-hero.
It's hard to know, at least so far for me.
even being a few books further in, I'm still kind of back and forth on him. I mean, there's a lot that happens, obviously. And I do start to like him a lot more as a person than I did initially. But even as the series goes on, it's still a little hard to tell.
Yeah, this book definitely still had the sort of journeyman vibe for me, because in The Gunslinger, he is walking and walking and walking and walking, and, you know, he stops for a little bit. But here he is doing a lot of walking, but it's not necessarily the same. I found this to be more interesting, and I did like The Gunslinger. I thought maybe just because it was a shorter Stephen King book, I kind of thought that one flew by, even if the story necessarily didn't. So, you know, these two are kind of even for me right now. I gave them both a 4 out of 5, but I think it's mostly just because these ones felt a little bit easier to read than a few that I've gone through recently. So I think it's within context of reading his catalog, his bibliography as a whole in chronological order, that sometimes I'm just like, yes, this was a nice break.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I haven't read anything else in his body of work.
I know you don't like horror as much, so...
No, I'm not a huge horror fan. Although I've never really tried reading horror. I know I just don't like horror movies. So maybe if I read it, would be a little bit different.
Yeah.
But yeah, since this is all that I know of his work, that first book did feel very slow to me. And I still feel like we're trying to get somewhere. We haven't quite gotten there yet. It is very like Lord of the Rings almost in that first book, where it's like, and we're walking and we're walking and we're walking.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one was a lot more interesting to me. Like seeing where he goes and like how these characters start to come together is really cool.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and talk about these new characters, because there are really 4 characters worth talking about, but 3 of them sort of make up the majority of the story. And obviously, you know, Roland is continuing his journey, but the first person who crosses paths with him is Eddie Dean, who is a drug addict. And how Roland gets to these people is, in his world, there are doors that take you to Keystone Earth, which is basically the real world as you and I would typically know it. So there is a multiverse thing going on in the Stephen King books here, and that's something that is used a lot in comics. So it's a concept I'm familiar with. I don't know how it plays into Stephen King stuff just yet. I haven't quite figured that out. But basically, when Roland goes through these doors, he is able to kind of take over someone's body. And it was very weird reading this at first, because I was kind of like, what is going on? You have this drug addict who is on a plane with drugs taped all over him, basically, to get by security, because clearly this was a time before the ginormous x-ray machines that you and I have probably been through a few times now. And he sort of just sets up this almost laughable scenario, even though it's, pretty serious. But then you have Roland coming in and taking over, and things just get so crazy from there. You're like, what is going on? And he opens the door in the bathroom of the airplane, and you're just like, this is so much weirdness going on with this scenario right now, because in a way, at first you kind of think the guy's just tripping out on drugs, but when you know it's Roland, you're like, oh, okay, there's definitely something interesting going on here.
Yeah, this is, I would say this is one of the first major instances of like seeing more of a magical quality to what's going on. Like, that Roland's world is very different than the world as we know it, but you don't really get the full effect of it until he's able to step through these doors into like modern, quote unquote, modern day Earth. And I say it like that because obviously he's going back to different time periods. So it's like not modern day, but it is like our world technically. So he steps through these doors and he ends up within the body of these people, and he's able to kind of control their movements and like hear their thoughts. And it's just like a very weird scenario to step into.
Yeah, it really is. And he even ends up taking over the body of a schizophrenic woman whose real name is Susanna Holmes, but her personalities are Odetta and Detta, and they're sort of warring with each other for which one is going to sort of be the prominent one and really just, be the one that is out at the moment, I guess, is the best way to put it. And you have those two conflicting personalities within this one person, and then Roland comes into the mix and takes over. And for a while there, it's like, okay, wait, this is a lot to keep up with. And
yeah, it's like, who's who?
Yeah, I definitely felt that too. And even though I really enjoyed this book, some parts I kind of had to like reread here and there. I was like, wait, did I just read what I thought I read? Is this what's happening? And I think sort of it wasn't until the middle of the book really where I think things started to pick up for me, because I kind of had it click as to what was happening and where this was taking us to, because none of these people are necessarily great people. They're not humanitarians or anything along those lines. They're sort of your everyday people who lean more towards the bad side.
Yeah. So like you said with Eddie, he's a heroin addict and he's like smuggling drugs on a plane. And then with Odetta and Detta is a very mean, very vicious woman. And she kind of lashes out at everybody around her. She goes into stores and she steals a lot. So she's in a wheelchair because she lost both of her legs in a train accident, and she rolls herself into department stores and just like steals things.
Yeah, and Odetta is kind of the complete opposite. So in a sense, Odetta is kind of like the best of this group of people because she's active in the civil rights movement, and she's also wealthy, which is something that is made not necessarily, a big deal of in the book, but they make sure that she's wealthy.
Yes. And they do kind of make a big deal out of it because she is a Black woman. So for a Black woman to be that wealthy, it wasn't super common in the time period that she exists within. So it is kind of a big deal. And it makes it an even bigger deal that she's got this dissociative, it's like schizophrenia. So it's this mental illness that like, back in those days, you didn't really talk about that kind of stuff. And it wasn't a very commonly known kind of thing. So it just makes her for this very like multifaceted, very interesting character.
Yeah. And this book was published in 1987. So even then, you still had a lot of things going on with the civil rights movement. And one could argue you still do today, which is a big topic of discussion. And it was just very interesting how her character was portrayed in this. And then you have the sociopath, psychopath, whichever one you want to call him, Jack Mort. He's an accountant, and he's just sort of the worst of all of them because he just kills random people because he finds it enjoyable. And those are sort of not only the worst kinds of killers, but the most terrifying because you never know what they're going to do if they don't have, a type, so to speak. I guess if anyone has paid attention to, shows about serial killers, Mindhunter, what have you, typically a serial killer has a specific type of person they go after, someone who reminds them of their mother or whatever it might be that's stuck with them and sort of just made them want to kill. But with someone who's just killing random people, it's unpredictable and it's just so much crazier to think about.
Yeah. And the thing with Jack is he is kind of a common thread amongst some of the characters in the book. So he is actually like you said, he takes pleasure in hurting people.
Mm-hmm.
So he actually is responsible for Odetta being the way that she is with this split personality.
Right.
And also for the loss of her legs. He dropped I want to say like a brick on her head when she was a child, which caused like the personality split. And then he pushed her in front of a train, and that's how she lost her legs.
Right.
And then he comes back again later on in the book. There's the boy Jake that we met in The Gunslinger, the first book.
Yeah.
And Jake also returns, and he pushes Jake into traffic. And him pushing Jake into traffic is what kills Jake and sends him into the world of the Gunslinger in the first book in the first place. So it's like just this weird, like, Jack is kind of...
He makes everything come full circle in a sense.
Yeah. He like just kind of weaves his way into their story. Not as like a major player, but in many ways he is a major player because, like you said, he kind of makes it come full circle.
And you have this sort of cruel justice because Roland ends up killing Jack by throwing him beneath the train, the same train that caused, Odetta to lose her legs. So you have this whole thing with Jack being such a crux of the plot in this book and even in the first book, and he just uses him and kills him. He's like, I don't want you coming through the door with me, basically.
And that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about how we wouldn't necessarily call Roland a hero.
Right.
Because it is like a very cruel kind of justice. Like obviously Jack is not a great person. He causes a lot of people pain and he hurts people. But that doesn't necessarily mean like a real hero wouldn't necessarily kill someone like that. Like they would bring them to justice and like bring them to the police or whatever. But Roland is just like, no, you're not coming with me. Your story ends here.
Yeah. What did you think of Odetta and Eddie getting married?
It's very strange.
Yes. Okay.
Because they're from two very different time periods. Eddie comes from a little bit later down the timeline, I think.
Yeah.
And like with Odetta and Detta's split personalities, the one really hates Eddie.
Yes.
And is very mean to him. But then when she comes through the doorway, it kind of takes the best of both of her personalities. So the kindness of Odetta and then like the strength of Detta and merges it into one person.
Yeah, I want to move on and talk about the doors real quick, though, because the doors have names, and I feel like a lot of thought went into those names based on the characters we were going to meet once Roland goes through those doors. And the first one is the prisoner. And I feel like when we meet Eddie, he's really just a prisoner of his addiction. He's stuck in this place and he can't get out because he is just so addicted to heroin that it's basically a jail sentence for him or even a death sentence.
Yeah. He's also very much a prisoner to his brother, who is the one responsible for getting him hooked on heroin in the first place.
Right.
And even though his brothers like kind of led him down this really like terrible path, he always believes the best in him and always believes that his brother is like looking out for him, even if he's not.
And his brother ultimately dies from the same kind of drugs that he's taking. So you would think maybe that would have sobered him up to see his brother go through that and have it cost him his life, but it doesn't. Instead, he just keeps taking more and more risks. You know, like I said earlier, he was traveling with heroin just like wrapped all around him under his clothes.
Yeah.
And then you have the second door where we meet Odetta and Detta, and that is called the Lady of Shadows. And that seems to have a lot to do with just the fact that she's wealthy, but she has sort of this own personal trauma that she's dealing with. And I imagine she deals with it more in the shadows and not really in front of everyone. I'm sure Odetta tries to be sort of the familiar face to everyone because she's obviously kinder and much more socially adept, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and she kind of has this darkness inside her, which is Detta.
And she seems unaware of it too.
Yeah, I think she like goes through periods of time where she doesn't really remember like what it is that she was doing.
Yeah. And to her, she thinks she kind of just blacks out. She isn't aware that this whole other personality is taking over. And I don't know too much about schizophrenia, but from what I've seen of it portrayed in other types of media, that does seem to be the case for some people. You know, they have these other personalities that take over so much to where they don't remember anything when they return to, you know, their normal state, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it is very much different for everyone. Like some cases are going to be more severe than others. But in some situations, yeah, I think that is the case where like it literally is two different people. And that is the case with Odetta and Detta, where she just like has no idea that during these blackouts, she's actually like out and doing things and, you know, stealing and meeting guys. And it's just a very strange situation.
Yeah, definitely. And the third door is labeled the pusher, which I feel like is the most straightforward because Jack pushes Odetta into the path of the train. He pushes Jake in front of the car, and it's just like, you know what? This dude sucks. He just pushes people to either their death or severe injuries.
Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward.
So what do you think of the plot more in general? You know, Roland has to go through these 3 doors, and at the same time, he's dying too. You know, he is not doing well because he was attacked by what they call lobstrosities. And according to the wiki, they look like a cross between scorpions and giant lobsters, and they're about 4 feet long with sharp serrated beaks and eyes on stalks. I don't even really know how to visualize that. My copy wasn't one of those illustrated copies.
Same.
So I didn't really get too many visuals with this. And if I'm not mistaken, it might be something that is relevant in the comics, because the comics you can obviously see a lot more than you read. And I know that there have been a ton of Dark Tower comics. I just don't know the specifics of those enough to know if, you know, you and I could just go pick one up and be like, oh, okay, that's what they look like.
Yeah, I guess in my head, they more looked like crabs. Like that's what I was picturing, was just these weird, like large crab-like creatures. But yeah, they attack Roland and he loses a few of the fingers on his right hand, which is like his strong hand in terms of like shooting and stuff, although he's kind of ambidextrous. But every time he goes through one of the doors and then comes back, his body has deteriorated even more. So that by the time he gets Eddie to come through the door with him, he's feverish, he's dying, like he desperately needs help. And Eddie kind of has to take care of him at that point. And they aren't even, like, they're not friends. Eddie is angry at Roland for bringing him into this world that he does not belong in.
Right. It's definitely a tough situation that Roland is in because his main focus is getting to the tower. and he's just sort of rolling with the punches because he doesn't really know what the next day holds. It's not like he's some all-seeing figure and he knows that this is going to go exactly as planned. In fact, he thinks it's quite the opposite. He thinks they're all going to die trying, basically, but he has to try anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, which is that's a daunting task to go on this journey thinking that you're not going to succeed.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this book did a much better job of making me more excited for the next books just because of how bad of a condition Roland is in. You know, in The Gunslinger, he could pretty much kill anyone and anything that got in his way. And it's very much the opposite in this book. Instead, his health is deteriorating. He has to have someone take care of him, and he's really just not doing so well. So I imagine something has to change because I know he's in the other books.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Is it in this book that he is able to get aspirin and he uses that to like fight off the infection from the bites?
I think it's penicillin.
Okay.
But he calls it like Keflex or something. But yeah, he goes to a pharmacy and robs a pharmacy when he takes over Jack's body. So he robs the gun shop and gets guns and ammo. And then he goes and robs the pharmacy. And the pharmacist was like, this is the weirdest robbery ever. He just gave us a Rolex for like, you know, maybe a few $100s worth of medicine.
Yeah. Like there are certain things that he just doesn't know, like what they're called here. He has different words for them. So I think there is a later book where he is able to get some aspirin, but he can't say aspirin for some reason. So he calls it Aston.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny because I'm reading Misery right now and the Keflex thing came up again. So I feel like that has to have been some sort of brand of penicillin or something, but I'm not 100% sure. It's like penicillin is one of the few things I'm allergic to, so I don't I don't really keep up with the names on it.
Yeah, it's a antibiotic.
Yeah. So it must have been like the name brand the main brand at the time. And that's why it popped up in 2 books back to back for Stephen King. Because I was like, okay, this can't be made up if it's in 2 completely unrelated books. Because as far as I know, Misery has absolutely nothing to do with the Dark Tower series.
Yeah, so I just looked it up and it is like a brand of antibiotic. So I guess that's like, it's not something that we picked up on, but if you do pick up on it, it's something else that kind of shows you that Roland's world is in a way related to ours. It's just like a very different version of it.
Yeah. I just thought it was funny how he was sort of not necessarily racking Jack's brain to figure out what words were, but he was sort of just considering Jack's brain as like an encyclopedia of knowledge.
Yeah.
And obviously, even though Jack is, this psychopathic killer, he was the smartest of the bunch, probably because he was an accountant. It's like, okay, this dude knows the words for like everything.
Yeah. He is super smart. He's just a terrible human.
Oh, absolutely. And just because someone is super smart, doesn't mean they aren't also a psychopathic killer. So it was just something Roland could use to his benefit at the time.
Yeah. And then once Jack kind of serves his purpose, he gets rid of him.
Yeah, which is kind of nice. Like you said, very anti-hero of Roland.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to discuss regarding the story before we sort of just dive into some general thoughts on the pace and everything like that? I don't really want to do speculation on where things go from here because you already know the answers, so I feel like that might not be as fun.
I know it's hard because I've read 3 books past this, so I have an idea of where things are headed. But no, I mean,
I could guess and you could laugh at me. But honestly, I kind of have no idea because of how he left this book. He didn't really give you any real clues.
Yeah. It doesn't really do much for you other than introduce you to the characters that are going to be your main characters throughout the rest of the series, or at least as far as I've gotten in the series.
There's a lot left.
Yeah. I think I have 3 or 4 books to go.
I think it might be 3 because I know there are 7 books, but then there's like the 4.5 book that came out after the 7th book.
Right.
I'm very confused. I don't know. I'm going to be reading them chronologically from when Stephen King released them. So I don't know if I'll be confused if I skip 4.5 and then go to 5. I don't know.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think 4.5 takes place just kind of within the confines of 4 and 5. So I think if you skip, you're fine, because I don't believe I read 4.5.
Okay. Good to know. Do you have any particular favorite moments from this book? Because I feel like so much happens, but at the same time, a lot of it felt like set up for what comes next for Roland.
Yeah, it is a lot of setup, which I think is why it took me so long to get into the series. I think it wasn't until like halfway through book 3 that I was finally like, wow, okay, I get this now. Because books 1 and 2 are so much just like preparing you for what's to come. In terms of like favorite parts, I mean, it's been a bit since I've read it, but I do kind of love Detta Walker, just because she doesn't take shit from anybody. She's not afraid to speak her mind, and she kind of puts Roland in his place a little bit.
Going into this, I thought Roland was going to be the most honest character, because he's very blunt, but he's not like purposefully mad or anything when he's being blunt. He's just like, this is how it is. I'm going to tell it like it is. And Detta is that way, but she has so much more personality behind that bluntness to where you really get a feel for who that character is. And, you know, she is not going to just be like, oh, well, Roland said it's going to be this way, so it must be this way, sort of thing. So yeah, I agree with you. I really liked sort of that tension between those two characters, because they were similar in a sense, but still so drastically different personality wise.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
For me, I think one of my favorite moments was that moment where he's just sort of done with Jack. I really do like the scene with the cops, though, before he goes back into the gun store and actually robs it, because this guy looks so harmless and so believable. And that's another thing that sort of makes Jack terrifying as, you know, a killer. He just looks like your everyday kind of businessman. And he goes up to these cops and he tells them that the store owner basically stole his wallet, and he had planted it so that it would look like the store owner stole his wallet, even though that's not remotely what happened. And the cops just believe this story. And, you know, we were talking about Roland's sort of being honest and blunt, but in this moment, he's not, because he needs something and he's not able to get it because this is a different time. And he's like, what on earth is a permit, you know, to buy bullets of all things? And he's just like, I'm a gunslinger. I should be able to get these things. So he has to find this way around it. And I think he finds a creative way that makes that moment entertaining, even if it is a bit brutal.
Yeah. And it is, he's not because he's such a blunt, straightforward person, he's not like super creative. So for him to have to think of a way to like make this happen is very funny.
Yeah, and he respects the cops at the same time. He's like, oh, they are gunslingers too. And while I was reading that, I was like, no, they're really not gunslingers in the same sense that you are, Roland.
No, not quite.
A little bit different.
But they try.
Yeah, so I just thought that was a nice, humorous moment in a series that I wasn't entirely convinced was going to have that much humor in it, but I think Stephen King finds ways to put that in without being so blunt about it, I guess, is just sort of the best way to put it. It's not like, hey, this is a thing you're supposed to laugh at. You just laugh at it because of how he's written Roland for 2 books in a row now.
Yeah, he just kind of sneaks it in there and it catches you off guard a little bit, but that's what makes it even better.
Yeah, it really does. We talked a little at the beginning about, you know, how we thought this was an improvement over The Gunslinger. And I mentioned, I gave both books a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. And I just think that he's done such great character work with these first 2 books, even if the journey and the plot in The Gunslinger was a little slower, because you have now confirmed for me that these 2 books are really a lot of setup. I think it just makes me appreciate the character work even more, because it's like, okay, if these 2 books were set up, especially for Roland, he has to have some big, big plans.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, there are very big plans. I mean, he's trying to find the tower, and it's this whole long journey to get there. But they get into a lot of trouble kind of along the way. So having this background knowledge of Roland, and as time goes on, you learn more about, his upbringing and his childhood and his start as a gunslinger. It all definitely helps you understand why he's on this journey and why he's trying to get to the tower and why he needs these people to help him.
Yeah, and I really like that. Obviously, when Stephen King started The Gunslinger, he knew that this was going to be a lengthy process. I think in either the introduction or an afterword in that book, he mentioned that, there would be 5 or 6 books, and obviously there are 8. So, clearly he went even further than maybe he initially planned to, and that's sort of just how the story played out. But since neither of us have finished, we don't really know just yet what exactly happens by the end of everything. And I think, fantasy isn't a genre that I really seek out when I'm looking for books to read. Obviously, Harry Potter is a big exception, because I don't know, something about Harry Potter was just so charming and enjoyable as a kid that I fell in love with those. And, you and I are slowly but surely discussing all of those books over on Welcome to Geekdom. And I just never really felt compelled to seek out other fantasy books. I have the Lord of the Rings books sitting on my shelf, and I've read The Hobbit, but I haven't read any of the 3 Lord of the Rings books. And I don't know if that's because I watched the movies and then I kind of lost interest in reading all 3 books, but my fantasy book collection is very, very, very small. So to be as into this as I am, I think it's just a testament to what Stephen King is able to do with his writing, because sometimes I read some of his stories and I'm like, okay, this might not be my favorite genre, but I could see how this story could work in other genres too. And I think that's what sort of makes some of the best stories, because you really just understand the characters at their core. And it doesn't necessarily need to be like, oh, well, this character only relates to this one very specific genre, and that's it. You can't understand this character outside of this context.
Yeah. You and I have very different book collections. I'm looking at my bookshelf now, and I'm just like, almost all of it is some form of like sci-fi fantasy-ish.
And yet we still have so much in common to talk about, so it's fine.
I know, it's great. But yeah, I mean, it definitely is a testament to like what Stephen King is able to do. To say that, like, as somebody who isn't necessarily a huge fan of fantasy, that you are very into this series. And it is something that I think, because it's fantasy, it's a little bit Western almost, just in like the whole gunslinger sense. And then you do get these kind of bits and pieces of a more modern world that somebody who isn't necessarily a fantasy fan would be able to get into, kind of deal.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that these stories aren't bashing you over the head with fantasy tropes and things like that. And not to say that it would be worse if they did do that. I personally wouldn't know what a lot of fantasy tropes are anyway, because it's not my genre that I typically read, but it just feels like he adds these elements to it. And obviously in the Dark Tower series, he's added enough of them for a lot of people to consider this more along the lines of the fantasy genre than anything else he's written. So you have this idea that, oh, this is his fantasy series, maybe I won't like it. And, doing this podcast, I was like, well, even if I don't like it, I'm going to read it. So I'm very glad that I do like it. And one of his other books is even more like fantasy medieval driven, and that is The Eyes of the Dragon, which actually ties into the Dark Tower series. And it came out between The Gunslinger and this book. So whenever you have time, it's a much shorter read. It's only like 300 and something pages, and my copy had very large text. So it was a pretty quick read, and knowing how fast you read, I'm sure you would get through it, within like a few days probably. So this series has gone beyond just these 8 books as well. You have mentions in other books, and Stephen King does that with everything. My head spins trying to keep up with some of the things that he has mentioned in other books. I'm just like, okay, my brain might explode doing this podcast, but it's been a lot of fun so far, and I'm really glad that I am enjoying these books in particular more than I expected, because I kind of expect to like all of his horror stuff because that's more up my alley.
Yeah.
But anywho, slight tangent aside, I mean, it's still relevant, but, not quite about the story. So do you have any final thoughts here?
No, I don't think so. I'm excited for you to keep reading, because you literally, from these first 2 books, you kind of don't have any idea where they're going. So I'm excited to hear what you think as the series continues on.
Yeah, one quick question for you. When you were reading these 2 books, if you recall, I know you said it's been a handful of months at least since you've read this one. Were you already sold on the series by the end of this book, or did it still take you another book or 2 to be like, oh, okay, now I understand the significance of those first 2?
I think it was book 3 before I was fully on board with this series. Just because these first 2 are such setups, and it felt like nothing much really happened. I mean, I know a lot happens in this book in particular, but it just didn't feel that way. Mm-hmm. But then in book 3, it finally all started to kind of come together and, I guess, take shape a little bit more. And that was when I finally was like, okay, I'm getting into this. I can see like where we're headed almost. Not really, because it takes so many twists and turns, but it definitely felt like it had more of a direction.
Good to know. I am definitely looking forward to getting to more of these books. And I know you are going to be on at least a few more of these. I don't know if you are the one signed up for all of them, but I will still discuss them all with you anyway.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Becky, for coming on to talk about this one.
No problem. Thank you, as always, for having me. I love our chats.
Of course. And to our listeners, thank you all for listening. You can find us at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. Not really doing Facebook for this one, so I highly recommend just checking out our Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.